This is part 11 of the Craftsman Emerson Gen 4 Rebuild series. If you haven't seen part 10, click the link at the top of the screen. In this video, we're going to be continuing with the assembly. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff and welcome to my shop. We got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. In part 10, we assembled the power panel, and in this video, we're going to be installing it. So we've got the 4 wires that come off of the power panel and connect to the switch panel. We're just going to make sure that those get routed properly inside the head casting. So there's a roll pin inside the head right there. And we are trying to route all 4 of these wires between the roll pin and the right side of that cavity and towards the front, which is facing towards the bottom of your screen right now. And the purpose of that roll pin is to keep the wires out of the center of the drill press so that they don't come in contact or interfere with the spindle pulley shaft that goes down through the center here with the bearings, or with the spindle or the quill coming up from the bottom, that all operate in that center shaft area. So I've just grabbed a pair of needle nose pliers and I'm just pulling on the end of each one of those wires to pull them out through the opening on the front of the head where the switch panel will eventually go. And the problem is they're kind of hanging up in that bottom right-hand corner. So once I get them free and get them out the opening, and it's a pretty big opening. I mean, you could probably reach in there with your fingers, but it's just easier to do it with the pliers. So they're routed just like that around that roll pin. And then we can go ahead and place the panel where it's supposed to be screwed into the head. So I ended up replacing the screws on this, and just like the previous owner, I didn't have any flat, just slotted screws. So for flat tips, the ones I've got are, I don't know what kind of head you call that, where it's got a long slot for a flat tip, but it's also a Phillips head in the center of it. And that's what they had at Home Depot or Lowe's. So that's what I ended up getting. And the original screws were just too boogered up for me to reuse. So the next thing we're going to be working on is the switches, and for that we'll be using or doing this part of the wiring diagram. So we have the switch mounting plate, and this is the motor or on-off switch, and it has the lockout missing in the center of it because you have to have it removed to install it. There are 4 screws to mount these 2 switches, and they are all tapered so that they sit flush once they're screwed in. So, and then the switch that goes on the left side is for the light. Like so. So once we've got all these switches mounted, then we can go ahead and install the cover, or the switch panel cover. And that's the piece that we redid with all the lettering on it. You have to lift the switches up to get that on there. Once you got that on there, then we can start connecting the wires. And we just do that exactly like the wiring diagram shows you to do. See, that one says RT, so that's the right top. And I'm going to leave the tape on these. Where they sit inside the head casting, it's not going to be an issue, so that they'll be marked if we ever have to take it apart again. And then it gets mounted with these screws. There's 4 of them. And yeah, once you've got them, so lining up those holes is a little weird, but once you've got 2 of them started, the rest of them are easy to do. And then you can reinstall that safety lockout piece in that in the drill switch or the motor switch. Okay, well, next we're going to install the spindle pulley assembly, and I just want to take a moment here to point out that there's a lip inside the bottom bore, and that is what the bottom bearing is going to rest on. So if we assembled the spindle pulley assembly correctly, then it will be at the proper height when it's fully seated inside the drill press head. And you'll see me reach up under the pulley here, and I'm making sure that bottom bearing is resting on that lip. So next we're going to install that machine screw in the side, and that's what holds the spindle pulley assembly inside the head casting. And here you can see that is the roll pin that we were routing the wires around. And there are the wires, the 4 wires that go to the switches. And there is your bottom bearing. And that is the machine screw that we just screwed in the side. So with all that assembled, now we can go ahead and put the power panel cover panel on, or cover plate on. And that just has 2 screws to mount it. All right, so next we're going to install the plastic or vinyl covers that go on those various lock handles. We removed these when we cleaned all this stuff up, and we're just sliding those back on. And for these last two, one is a little bit smaller in diameter than the other. You can barely even tell the difference. So the smaller one goes on that last piece that I put it on. Next is the column collars. We're just going to begin assembling them. So they have carriage bolts, which have kind of like a square base to the bolt, so it fits inside the square hole. And we'll just getting the nuts started on them so that we can slide them down the column. We'll do that for both of them. So we're ready to start assembling this drill press properly. So this is the base, and we're going to lubricate the base. So I'm using Super Lube here, and I'm just applying it to the inside bores in the base, all 3 of them. And then we've got the base lock screw, and we're going to go ahead and put some Super Lube on the threads. Since the base is typically what rusts first on these drill presses because it's close to the ground. And we'll start that lock screw. Since there's paint inside the hole that this screws into, I have to use a ratchet to get it going. And then we're ready to go ahead and install the column. So again, there are 3 bores here. There's a top one, a middle one, and a bottom one. We're just going to get the column to go all the way to the floor first. And once we have it all the way to the floor, we're going to tilt everything on its side. And then we're going to retract the column so that about 1/8 of an inch of the bore is exposed, like that. And then tighten down the lock screw, because we don't want the column actually resting on the floor. And then once we stand it up, we can finish tightening it down. There's no lock shoe on the Gen 4s. So here we are with the table, and we're going to lube up the bores on the table with Super Lube. So it has 2 column bores, and then it has the bores that the lock sits in right there. And once we get that all lubed up, we're ready to go ahead and install the first column collar. So this one sits under the table, and we're going to use it to just rest the table on when we put the table on. So we'll lock that in place. And then we can slide the table on, and it'll sit there just fine. And now we can go ahead and lube up the lock for the table. So the lock is 3 parts. You've got the lock nut, the sleeve nut, and then the handle screw. So the lock nut goes from the inside, kind of the center of the table. And then the sleeve goes in from the outside. And there are flats on these 2 parts, and you want those flats to engage the column. I can show you a little better when we do the headlock, and then we've got the handle screw. We just lube it up as well, and go ahead and insert it, and then we can tighten it down. All right, so we'll just reposition the table a little bit, make sure it's kind of center. And next we're going to lube up the column bores in the head. There are 2 of these. And if you recall how much trouble we had getting the head off of this drill press, and that was a combination of the rust on the inside of the head and the rust on the column. All that is gone now, so it should slide on this column just fine. And I'm using a ruler here to get a measurement on how deep those 2 bores are, so that we can apply this column collar at the proper height. And when we set the head on top of it, the head will already be right where it needs to be. I want to say it was something like a 6 1/4 inches. I don't remember exactly, but no big deal. So we tighten down the column collar. And then we're ready to install the head. So we have not routed the power cable through the back hole yet, because it'll get hung up on the column if we do that. So we can do that in a minute. We'll just make sure the head's centered. And we're going to go ahead and lube the bores for the lock and the quill lock. So the headlock and the quill lock. You can get this Super Lube online or at some of your auto parts stores. They probably have it at Ace Hardware as well. I think I got this last can off of Amazon. So I have to apologize. This is the motor mount, and my battery died, and I didn't realize it when I was recording. So you don't actually see me mounting it on the drill press, but you've got these 2 comb point set screws, and each one of them has a nut. And you basically just center it on the drill press right there. And don't over tighten those set screws, otherwise you'll start bending that mount. Okay, so talking about the lock, there's the flat and there's your column. So you want that flat to engage the column. We've already lubed up these parts. That's the sleeve, and the lock nut is on the other side. It actually has two flats, and that's so you can determine where you want that handle to stop when you tighten it down. There's the handle and screw. We'll just tighten it down. And we're done with that. Next, we're going to lube up the pinion bore. There's two bores in there. So next, we're going to assemble the chuck. And I have a video that covers everything you ever wanted to know about the Jacobs chuck, and I'll put a link to it here. But installing it, removing it, disassembling it, reassembling it, all of that's in that video. So these jaws, they have to go in a specific order. And on the Jacobs chuck body, each one of the bores that these jaws ride in is numbered. So I'm using this NLGI2 Mystic grease to grease up those bores. And as I've done this more and more, I've gotten a little bit more conservative in the amount of grease that I use. But then each one of the jaws have to go in, like I said, a specific order. And if you don't put them in the proper order, then the chuck won't operate properly. So nothing too wacky here. And like I said, I go into way more detail in the Omnibus video. And then next we've got the nut unit, or the split nut, and we're just going to lube it up. And then we'll align those jaws and then put the split nut on the chuck. And hold the split nut closed and then rotate the chuck. And if we did everything correctly, all three of those jaws should come out and meet perfectly, which they do. So we'll back that down a little bit, about halfway. You want the jaws protruding about a half an inch. If you don't do that, then you can break the jaws when you go to reassemble or disassemble the chuck. So here we have the chuck sleeve that we're just lubing up, and then we'll slide that over the split nut to keep it all in one place. And then we're going to come over here to this vise, and I'm just using a sleeve from another chuck, but you can get a pipe that's basically the same diameter as the sleeve, and then compress the sleeve onto the body. Like so. And that's a seated sleeve right there. So then we'll just make sure the chuck works properly. Open it all the way up and then close it all the way. And we're good to hook. So next we're going to install the chuck on the spindle quill assembly. And to do this, we're going to use a large Allen wrench, and we're just lining the flats of the Allen wrench up with the flats on the jaws, and tighten the chuck down. We'll use a key. Then we're going to put the Allen wrench inside the vise. That'll hold the Allen wrench in place, or well, that'll hold the chuck in place. And then we can go ahead and thread on the spindle. Make sure you have the feed stop collar installed, because you'll have to take the chuck off again if you don't. And then we'll use a wrench. This is a spanner wrench. And in the omnibus video, I have a link to where to get that spanner wrench or one like it. And we just tighten down the safety lock collar. And then we can remove that Allen wrench, and we are done with the spindle quill assembly. Ta-da! Next, we're going to assemble the pinion hub. So we're just going to insert the pinion into the hub. If you painted it, it may be really tight. You just want to make sure those holes are all lined up properly. And then you have a fiber washer that is supposed to be there. And then we can go ahead and lube up the pinion. So next we're going to install the spring. So there's a roll pin on the inside of the head casting that one end of the spring gets looped onto, like so. And then I've got another video about the spring, and I will put a link to it here. And then we can insert the pinion and hub over the spring. Then we're going to use a screwdriver to push the spring back towards the hub so that we can see those loops through the holes in the side of the pinion. And I've got a small pick here. I'm just going to stick through those to capture that spring. And then I've got a 1/4 inch punch that I'm going to run opposite the pick so that that spring is really captured. And the pin that we're going to be using to lock the spring in place is the same size. It's a 1/4 inch, so all this should work really well. It may take you a couple tries. That spring may fall off of the pick or something. But we've got it captured because we've got tension on the hub. So now we're ready to install that pin. And that pin has splines on one side, if you recall when we drove it out. So you want to make sure that you're driving it with the splines facing away from the hole. In other words, the smooth end of that pin goes in first. Once we've got it kind of started, then we can use another punch to just drive that pin in, pushing the other punch out of the way, like so. And then we'll make sure that that pin is fully seated. And if we did all that correctly, then we have the spring captured with that pin. And when you pull out on the hub, it should snap back. All right, so next we're just lubing up the splines on the spindle and then lubing up the quill. Again, we're just using super lube here. So notice the gear rack on the quill. It's going to be engaging with the gears that are on the pinion. So you're going to want that gear rack facing towards the column. And to get it to go in, we're going to have to pull out on the hub so that those gears can clear the gear rack. And then once we get it up there a little bit, then we need to rotate the spindle pulley assembly a little bit so that the splines on the top of the spindle engage the spindle pulley. Then we can push the hub back in, and that should capture the quill. Next, we're going to install the depth gauge or depth scale. It just has 2 screws that lock it in place. And notice that the holes in the depth scale are oblonged, and that's so that you can loosen those screws and move it up or down a little bit to set it properly once we get everything installed. So right now the quill is being held in the drill press by the pinion. So next we can install the depth stop rod, and it has a jam nut that goes on the bottom of it. And we still have not tightened down that screw that is on the feed stop bracket. So now we will tighten that down. Make sure the feed stop bracket is fully seated on the quill. There's a lock washer there, so make sure you tighten it down good. Once we've got that, we're going to make sure that the feed stop rod or depth stop rod is moving freely, and we will tighten it down. We're going to use a 1/2 inch wrench up on the rod to keep it from twisting when we tighten down that jam nut. And that is going to wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe. If you have questions or comments, leave them in the comments section. And in the next video, we will be continuing with the assembly. So until then, I will see you next time.